Hey guys, this is April, and today we're going to talk about Mannerism. So this movement is one of those movements that tends to get the short end of the stick for as discussion in art classes. One of the big reasons why is it stands off as kind of bizarre compared to what happened before in the High Renaissance. There's these major differences. And also, it can be kind of confusing to talk about because Mannerism coincides with late Renaissance art. And then you also have many artists that either become Mannerists or they stop being Mannerists and become more traditional Renaissance artists. Or if you go up north, you have artists that are making both Manneristic paintings and late Renaissance paintings at the same time. For this video, I'm going to cover the atmosphere that was brewing during this time, during the Mannerism movement, and then I'm going to cover the major traits that are typical of the paintings and sculptures created during this time. Now, not every single painting that you look at will have every single one of these traits. It's going to vary between region and artist. And a big reason that's the case is this is a very experimental moment in art history. When it comes to Manneristic artists, they greatly admired the masters of the High Renaissance, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo. They actually copied a lot of their work that was a common practice. It should come as no surprise that the most famous art historian, Vasari, was a Manneristic artist. These guys just adored these individuals. Apparently, they even tried to steal their work. Apparently, according to Vasari, Michelangelo had people break into his studio and try to steal his drawings. That said, though, these artists were still interested in creativity. They wanted to figure out what was the next logical step for as creating fine art. And even Michelangelo, whose later work is often considered Manneristic, said those who are followers can never pass by whom they follow. Artists began to experiment with what was developed during the High Renaissance. Mannerism is essentially a reaction to the High Renaissance ideas. So they may break the rules, or they may exaggerate concepts. So they might make perspective extreme. The best way I can describe the atmosphere during this movement is one of adventure. And in many ways, it is reminiscent of what happens during the modern art period, in which you have artists questioning how to make something different. When it comes to Mannerism's ideology, they were really far ahead for their time. So it's no surprise in which some of these paintings that you might look at seem ahead of their time. So let's go ahead and cover the major characteristics of this art movement. Now, before I start spewing out artist names, I just want to forewarn you guys that I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of some of these Italian artists' names because I cannot roll my R's to save my life. So keep that in mind when it comes to this video, but I will try my best to get the pronunciation as accurate as possible. Now, one of the first traits that you're going to notice in many of these paintings is the compositions. They tend to be very tense and unstable. You're not going to have harmonious, easy to look at compositions like you saw in the High Renaissance. They create this tension by cropping off figures towards the edges. You also have very little breathing room. There's often a lot of detail, a lot of visual imagery to look at. One of the best comparisons far as High Renaissance versus Mannerism is looking at the Last Supper. If you look at Leonardo's Last Supper, the composition is very, very controlled. You could definitely see the triangular forms that each of these group of bodies is making. But then when you compare that to Tintoretto's Last Supper, far more tense, far more action-packed, far less stable. There's a lot more going on, a lot more detail. It's very difficult for the eye to find a resting point, a place to stop and just absorb the information. Another trait that these Manneristic artists played with was severe shifts in scale. We can see that in Tintoretto's Last Supper. He's definitely pushing perspective heavily in this painting. Another example that is very nice to discuss this with is the Madonna with the Long Neck by Parmigianino. In this painting, we have perspective that's so severe that it feels unrealistic, it feels artificial. It's very jarring to the eye. So here we have Madonna with the Christ child on her lap, but in the background, in the far, far distance, we have another figure, and then right beside it, we have a series of columns that are really crammed right beside one another. So here we have this group of figures extremely close to us, and then something in the far, far distance. So we have this very severe shift. So that's why it feels unnatural. It feels unrealistic. Another thing that artists played with was their color palette. And in general, the colors that these Manneristic artists tended to use tend to have a cold tint to them. I've also heard them described as acidic. They are not very warm. Probably the best place to see this is in the human forms. When you look at the skin color, their skin is extremely pale. It's so pale that it's almost like porcelain. One of the traits that's heavily discussed are the human figures, how they're approached. First off, Manneristic artists tend to use unnatural, if not impossible poses. So you're going to have poses in which the figures feel like they're floating or that they're about to trip. You'll also have figures in poses that it seems like their neck is broken or their arm is out of joint. In this work by Brosino, we have Venus and Cupid, and their pose is so awkward. We have Cupid in which he has his back bent in a very uncomfortable fashion, in which his butt is sticking out. And then Venus, the way that she is sitting on her legs, it feels like she's floating. It doesn't make logical sense. Another thing that many of these artists would tweak is the anatomy. So they would often elongate the figures. So you're going to have very long limbs, long necks. We'll also have long torsos and long legs. One of the big reasons we see this popping up in Manneristic art is during this time period, there is a lot of Hellenistic sculpture being dug up. Artists began to copy these works, just like they were copying Michelangelo's work, Leonardo's work, Raphael's figures. When it comes to Hellenistic sculpture, they're known to exaggerate the human form. They're known to play with anatomy. The last major trait of this art movement is their unusual approach to traditional subject matter. These artists weren't afraid to make the content unclear, if not downright disturbing. One example I have is by Bassano, in which is depicting a baptism of Christ. Typically, this scene would be taking place during daytime, but here the artist has turned it night. It is pitch black outside. This is also happening in the north as well. For example, we are having artists that are playing with landscape as a genre. We're also having artists playing with still lifes, turning them into epic paintings and mixing them with genre work and religious work. We also have artists that are completely removed from content. For example, The Rape of the Sabine Woman by Jean Biogna. Originally, it didn't have any backstory. The artist was only concerned about the composition. He essentially set himself up with the challenge of grouping three figures together. It isn't until after the fact that the content was applied or suggested. Essentially, this is art for art's sake. Another incredible work by Jean Bologna is the Eponine Colossus. With this work, you get a clear sense of how experimental artists were becoming during this time. First off, this sculpture is big. is very large, very monumental. It also is a water feature. Water would have came out from the beard as well as from the beast in its grasp. It also had rooms on the interior. You could have gone inside and seen frescoes of miners digging up precious minerals. There's also was a room for a small orchestra to play music to please the guests. And one of the coolest things, in my opinion, is in the head there would have been a fireplace that could have been lit, and smoke would have came out from the nostrils of this Colossus. Essentially, the rough treatment of some of the textures on this figure is supposed to represent the jagged forms of the Apennine Mountains. So it essentially is an allegorical figure for a mountain range. Now, one thing you might be asking yourself is, why did this movement come to an end? Well, basically, the Council of Trent happened. So the Council of Trent essentially was a series of meetings, and during one of those, the group of people came to a consensus of what art should be in Catholic churches, what the emphasis should be put on. And essentially it went against the ethos of Mannerism. The Catholic Church wanted paintings that emphasized piety, that were clear, that were easily understood, that were realistic. Since Mannerism wasn't concerned with these ideas, it faded away. So that's all I have for today. If you guys have any questions, leave them down in the comments below.